March 18th, 2000. Whatcom County, Washington. A damaged Jeep belonging to 23-year-old Leah Roberts is found at the bottom of an embankment after it presumably crashed off a remote highway. 9 days earlier, Leah had left her home in North Carolina to take a cross-country road trip, but even though all of her personal possessions are left behind at the accident scene, Leah herself is missing. The investigation uncovers evidence to suggest that the accident was staged and that Leah may have been harmed by an unknown third party, but no trace of her is ever found. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering one of my most highly requested missing persons cases in the history of this podcast, the 2000 disappearance of Leah Roberts. This story has been featured on the TV shows Unsolved Mysteries and Disappeared, and ever since I started The Trail Went Cold over 5 years ago, I probably rank this among my top 10 most highly requested cases I haven't covered yet. Until now. Leah Roberts was a young woman who seemed to be struggling to find herself before she abruptly decided to leave her home in North Carolina to take a cross-country road trip without telling anyone beforehand. It seems like she was planning to visit a location from one of the novels written by her favorite author, Jack Kerouac, and sure enough, her abandoned Jeep would soon be discovered near that location, around 3,000 miles away in Washington state. On the surface, it seemed like Leah had gotten into a serious accident after crashing down an embankment into a wooded area, but an extensive search of the area turned up no trace of her, and oddly, there didn't seem to be any evidence to suggest she had suffered any injuries from the crash. The investigation would turn up some odd clues, including an anonymous phone call about a sighting of Leah looking disoriented at a gas station, and an eyewitness who claimed he had seen Leah with an unidentified man at a shopping mall restaurant shortly before she disappeared. It seems police are now leaning towards the theory that Leah was not even inside the Jeep when it crashed down the embankment, and the entire accident scene was staged. But if so, what actually happened to her? Well, that's definitely a big mystery, so we're going to have a lot to discuss on this episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the disappearance of Leah Roberts. Our story begins in 2000, and our central figure is 23-year-old Leah Roberts, who currently lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, and shares a rented house with her roommate, Nicole Bennett. Leah was originally born in Durham, and was the youngest of 3 children, as she has a brother named Heath and a sister named Kara. Unfortunately, the siblings have dealt with unimaginable tragedy over the past few years, having lost their mother to heart disease and their father to a chronic lung illness. The tragedy was further compounded for Leah during the fall of 1998, when she was involved in a serious car accident after crashing into a truck, which left her with a punctured lung and a shattered femur, which required a metal rod to be inserted into her leg. Even though Leah made a full recovery, the combination of the accident and the loss of both of her parents seemed to change her outlook on life. At the start of the new millennium, Leah was in her senior year at North Carolina State University where she had planned to get a degree in Spanish and anthropology, but even though she was only a few months away from graduation, Leah made the sudden decision to drop out. At this point, Leah did not have a job and was living off an inheritance her parents had left for her. She would spend several hours a day hanging out and writing in her journal at a local coffee house where the staff had nicknamed her Double Cat Girl since she showed up and ordered a double cappuccino every single morning. Leah was also very interested in poetry and spirituality and had taken up such other hobbies as guitar and photography. On March the 9th, Leah's roommate Nicole returned home from work and noticed that Leah and her white 1993 Jeep Cherokee were not there, and a pet kitten which Leah had adopted named Bee was also gone. Earlier that morning, Leah had spoken with her sister Kara on the phone, but never shared any plans with her about going anywhere. Leah and Nicole had spoken about doing some babysitting together the following day, but Leah missed their scheduled appointment, and by this point, she still had not returned home. Over the next few days, Nicole received a number of phone calls from people who claimed that Leah had made plans with them, but never showed up or attempted to contact them. Leah never contacted her family either, which concerned Kara enough to pay a visit to her house on March the 13th. When she checked Leah's bedroom, Kara noticed that a large number of her clothes and personal possessions were missing, which seemed to suggest that Leah had left on a trip, even though she never told anyone about her plans. For this reason, Kara still felt compelled to contact the police and officially report Leah missing. Kara decided to perform another search of Leah's room, and this time, she finally noticed a note Leah had left behind on her dresser. It was accompanied by some cash that Leah had left for Nicole in order to cover her share of the rent and expenses for the month. The note contained a drawing of the Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland and some cryptic writing in which Leah implied that she had gone away on a lengthy road trip but would eventually return. The line which really stuck out was, quote, "I'm not suicidal, I'm the opposite. Remember Jack Kerouac," end quote. Now, Leah had a particular fascination with Beat Generation novelist Jack Kerouac, who found fame during the 1950s after the publication of his autobiographical novel On the Road, a fictionalized story which was based on the personal travels of himself and his friends across the United States. In fact, a woman whom Leah had hung out with at the coffee house would claim that Leah had discussed The Dharma Bums, Kerouac's follow-up novel to On the Road. Once again, this book is a fictionalized story based on events from Kerouac's life, including his time working as a U.S. Forest Service fire lookout at Desolation Peak, which was located in the North Cascade Mountains of Washington state, just south of the Canada-United States border. Leah was fascinated by the novel's theme of leaving behind the materialism of modern life and had expressed a desire to visit Desolation Peak. Well, since Leah had previously granted Kara power of attorney over her bank accounts, she was able to look up Leah's financial transactions and track her movements since she left Raleigh on March the 9th. Well, sure enough, she discovered that Leah withdrew $3,000 that same afternoon and then used her debit card to pay for a motel room near Memphis, Tennessee. By following her subsequent debit transactions, Kara was able to determine that Leah had spent the next few days traveling west on Interstate 40 until she reached California and started traveling north on Interstate 5. The last recorded transaction was when Leah purchased gas in Brooks, Oregon at 12:57 a.m. on March the 13th. Since Leah appeared to be heading in the direction of Washington state, it seemed plausible that she was planning to visit Desolation Peak, but it wasn't long before a shocking discovery would be made. On March the 18th, a couple was jogging on a remote logging road called Canyon Creek Road, located next to Mount Baker National Forest in Whatcom County, Washington. The road was adjacent to Mount Baker Highway, and the couple noticed some articles of clothing, including a shirt hanging from a tree branch next to an embankment. This embankment was near a slight curve at the top of an uphill slope of Mount Baker Highway, and when the couple took a closer look, they noticed that a wrecked Jeep Cherokee was at the bottom. Sure enough, when the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office arrived at the scene, they noticed that the Jeep had North Carolina license plates, and they were soon traced back to Leah Roberts. However, there was no sign of Leah anywhere, even though virtually all of her personal possessions, such as her guitar, compact discs, clothing, passport, driver's license, and checkbook, were inside or had been scattered around the Jeep. And while some cat food and a cat carrier were in the vehicle, Leah's pet kitten B was also missing. A more thorough search of the Jeep would also uncover a pair of pants containing over $2,400 in cash, and an engagement ring which had belonged to Leah's late mother was found underneath a floor mat. This would cause great concern for the Roberts family, since the ring was one of Leah's most treasured possessions, and she almost never took it off. At the time the Jeep was discovered, some of its broken windows were covered by blankets and pillows, presumably because someone had used the vehicle as a shelter. The condition of the Jeep seemed to indicate that it had been traveling between 30 to 40 miles per hour when it went over the embankment, and since the contents of the vehicle had been tossed around inside, it likely rolled over at least once before it landed upright. But oddly, there was no sign of blood or any other physical evidence inside or around the Jeep to indicate that someone had been seriously injured. Since there were no shatter marks on the glass or a stretching of the seatbelt, it almost appeared like there were no occupants inside the vehicle when it crashed, though there was nothing to indicate that it had been rigged to go down the embankment on its own. Even if Leah had survived and was picked up by a passing motorist, there were no records of anyone matching her description having checked in to any of the local hospitals. Since the Jeep was discovered on national forest land, the FBI would assist the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office with the investigation, and an extensive search was performed of the forest and the surrounding area with tracking dogs. Metal detectors were also used in case they picked up the metal rod which had been inserted in Leah's leg following her previous accident 2 years earlier. However, no trace of Leah could be found anywhere, so her siblings, Heath and Kara, traveled to Whatcom County in order to assist with the search effort and circulate missing persons flyers. Investigators eventually uncovered some security camera footage from the gas station in Brooks, Oregon, where Leah had stopped to purchase fuel shortly before 1 a.m. on March the 13th. The footage showed Leah completing her transaction inside the convenience store while she was alone, and everything seemed to be normal with her, though she appeared to turn her head several times to glance outside into the parking lot. Since the gas station did not have any exterior cameras, it was impossible to determine if Leah might have been staring at something. If Leah kept traveling north on Interstate 5, she eventually would have wound up in Bellingham, Washington, 300 miles away, where she could have turned east onto Mount Baker Highway. The embankment was located about 40 miles outside of Bellingham, and since Desolation Peak was located further east in that direction, it seemed even more likely that this was Leah's intended destination before the crash. It would soon be confirmed that Leah did stop in Bellingham, as a search of the Jeep uncovered a ticket stub for a screening of the movie American Beauty, which took place at the cinema at the Bellis Fair Mall at 2:10 p.m. on March the 13th. This compelled Heath and Kara to start circulating Leah's missing persons flyers around the mall, and she would eventually be recognized by employees from the mall's only sit-down restaurant, and they said that she stopped there for a meal on the same afternoon she saw the movie. They claimed that Leah entered the restaurant alone and sat down at the bar before two men showed up at separate times and sat down on each side of her, and Leah could be seen engaging them in conversation. Once Leah's disappearance started generating publicity, investigators would be contacted by a man who recognized her photo and confirmed that he was one of the men who sat down next to her. He said Leah specifically told him about her love for Jack Kerouac and her travel plans, which seemed to confirm it was actually her. Police eventually tracked down the second man who spoke with Leah, and he corroborated this story, but he added an additional detail. He claimed that Leah left the restaurant with a third man whom she referred to as Barry, and this witness provided such a detailed description of Barry that investigators were able to put together a composite sketch for him. However, the first man contradicted this story and claimed that Leah left alone, and there were no other witnesses from the restaurant who could corroborate having seen the mysterious Barry. There would be an additional strange lead when the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office received a phone call from an anonymous male 1 week after the discovery of Leah's Jeep. The man claimed that his wife had seen a disoriented-looking woman whom he believed was Leah Roberts at a Texaco gas station in the city of Everett, located about 60 miles south of Bellingham. However, before the police could ask him for any further details, the caller seemed to panic before he abruptly hung up. This led to speculation that Leah could have become disoriented and lost her memory following the accident, before she somehow hitched a ride out of the area and found her way to Everett. Leah's story would capture the attention of Unsolved Mysteries, who produced a segment about the case which aired in August of 2001, but it did not lead to any further developments. Kara eventually made contact with a missing persons advocate named Monica Kaysen, the director of a non-profit organization in Wilmington, North Carolina, called the Community United Effort for Missing Persons, aka the Q Center. On the 4-year anniversary of Leah's disappearance, the Q Center would organize a caravan to travel across the country on Leah's exact route from Raleigh to Whatcom County in order to spread awareness of her story. In November of 2005, both Kara and Monica Kaysen made an appearance on Larry King Live to discuss Leah's disappearance, in which Kara would state, quote, "Leah was a young woman who was lost. You know, by the time Leah was 22, she had lost both of her parents, and here she is on the verge of graduating from college, and I think she just really felt lost and didn't have a lot of direction, and I feel like she took this trip as a soul-searching trip. I think she just needed to go and get away to clear her mind." End quote. 1 year later, the original detective on Leah's case retired, and it would be reassigned to 2 other detectives who decided to take a fresh look at everything. At this point, the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office still had Leah's Jeep in storage, and after looking through the original paperwork, the 2 detectives realized that no one had ever looked under the Jeep's hood, so they decided to do so themselves. They would discover that the vehicle's starter motor had been tampered with, and a wire to the starter relay had been cut. This meant that if someone wanted to intentionally crash the Jeep down the embankment while it was unoccupied, they could have turned the key and accelerated the vehicle without stepping on the gas pedal. Some fingerprints were also found on the underside of the hood, as well as traces of male DNA on an article of Leah's clothing. The detectives decided to place their focus back on the male witness who had claimed he saw Leah leaving the restaurant at the Bellis Fair Mall with a man named Barry. It turned out this man had a military background and had worked as a mechanic, which could have given him the necessary knowledge to tamper with the Jeep's starter motor. This man was living in Canada at this point, so investigators went to the trouble of obtaining his fingerprints and DNA. In February of 2011, the investigation Discovery true crime show Disappeared aired an episode about this story, in which detectives claimed that this man's prints did not match the prints found on the hood, but they were still waiting for the results of the DNA testing. However, there has never been any public follow-up on what actually happened with the DNA, but I'll be discussing this issue in more detail in a little while. At the time of this recording, 21 years have passed since Leah Roberts went missing, and there are still no conclusive answers about what happened to her. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. As I've mentioned numerous times on this podcast, I have a particular fascination with unsolved cold cases in which victims wind up dead or going missing at locations they did not seem to have any reason to be at. Here, Leah Roberts seemingly left her home in North Carolina and decided to drive 3,000 miles across the country to Washington State without telling anyone before her Jeep wound up at the bottom of an embankment at a remote area. As crazy as that might sound, there was a plausible reason why Leah decided to travel to this location, as she developed quite the fascination towards Jack Kerouac and was likely heading towards Desolation Peak, which had been prominently featured in his novel, The Dharma Bums. But obviously, something went horribly wrong before she arrived. I can certainly understand why this has always been one of my most highly requested cases, and you can see a number of parallels between Leah's story and the highly publicized disappearance of Maura Murray, as she went missing only 4 years later after getting into an accident at a remote location while in the midst of an unexplained trip. I first became familiar with the Leah Roberts case after watching the Unsolved Mystery segment during the early 2000s, and to be quite honest, I initially suspected that she might have had some undiagnosed mental health issues which compelled her to make this cross-country odyssey. Given that her Jeep crashed into an embankment located next to a curve on a remote highway, I lean towards Leah getting into an accident which caused her to become disoriented and wander off into the woods, where she died of exposure, and all the subsequent searches of the area just missed her remains. Or alternatively, if her mental health was already in a fragile state, maybe the accident caused Leah to suffer some sort of breakdown, and she decided to walk into the woods and take her own life. However, when the Disappeared episode came out in 2011, it revealed a bunch of new information about the case I had never heard before, and caused me to look at Leah's disappearance in a different light. This was the first time I learned about the sighting of Leah at the Bellosphere Mall restaurant, as well as the strange story provided by the eyewitness about her leaving with a guy named Barry. The discovery that the Jeep's starter motor had been tampered with did not take place until years after the Unsolved Mystery segment aired, and this seemed to suggest that someone intentionally crashed the Jeep down the embankment while it was unoccupied. If so, then this would definitely make it more likely that Leah was the victim of foul play from an unknown third party. I'm sure it's tempting to believe that the mysterious Barry was the killer, but there's been a lot of skepticism about whether Barry even existed in the first place. The Disappeared episode gives off the impression that the male witness who was with Leah at the restaurant completely made up the story about Barry and is the strongest suspect in her disappearance. Well, this person's identity has never been released publicly, so we only know a scant few details about him, but the episode leaves us with a number of unanswered questions. Well, several years ago, a blog called The Red Dirt Report published an article about Leah's case, and a poster popped up in the comments section who claimed he was the witness from the restaurant. He said the detectives totally misrepresented a lot of the facts about him during their interviews on the Disappeared episode, so he wanted to share his side of the story. This blog has since been taken down, but many of this guy's comments were transcribed onto a post about this case at the Unresolved Mystery subreddit, so I'm going to share some of them now. Of course, there's no way of knowing if this commenter is legitimate, so take everything I share with a huge grain of salt, but here's his version of events. Well, the Disappeared episode gave off the impression that the witness moved to Canada after he was investigated. The commenter said this is a huge misconception because he actually lives in Canada and was only visiting Bellingham at that time because his two sons live there. Even though the episode was very open-ended about the testing of the male DNA found on Leah's clothing, the commenter maintains that neither the DNA or fingerprints matched him, stating, quote, "I've asked for a letter stating that my DNA and prints be destroyed as per the court order. This was to be done as soon as they tested me against their evidence. This was in 2007. The Whatcom County Sheriff's Department has been narrow-sighted and not very honest. They continue to play games, and the level of their incompetence is overwhelming." End quote. He still continues to stick to his original story that he saw a man enter the restaurant and call out Leah's name, and she replied by calling him Barry before they left together. The commenter also says he fears that he will be arrested if he attempts to return to the United States. Again, I have no idea if this commenter was legitimate or if anything he said was true, but what we do know for certain is that it's been 10 years since the Disappeared episode originally aired, and nothing has ever officially been reported about the DNA testing. So I can only assume that the DNA was not a match, and this is probably a dead end. But before we talk more about that, let's start at the beginning. It's tough to know what was going on in Leah's mind when she decided to leave on her cross-country odyssey. Since she had made plans for later that week, and did not tell her roommate or anyone from her family that she was planning to take this trip, it almost sounds like it was a spur-of-the-moment decision. While Leah did leave behind a note, along with enough money for her roommate to cover expenses while she was gone, it is odd that she left it in her bedroom rather than out in the open because it took 5 days for anyone to find it. It seems obvious that experiencing the deaths of both of her parents, as well as surviving a near-fatal car accident within one 3-year period, had a tremendous impact on Leah and completely changed her outlook on life. In fact, she would describe surviving the accident as feeling like she was, quote-unquote, born again, and it seemed like she only wanted to live life to the fullest. It's not uncommon for young people to become disillusioned with university and drop out before they complete their degree, but Leah decided to do so when she was only a few months away from graduation. Her family theorized that Leah may have just soured on the entire concept of a degree and disliked the notion that you needed one in order to be a success at life. After all, her idol Jack Kerouac had dropped out of university, and he eventually achieved his success by taking adventurous road trips and writing about them. I know this must sound like the ultimate cliche, but it seems apparent that Leah was trying to find herself, and maybe she thought this spontaneous 3,000-mile cross-country road trip would help her do so. We know that Leah left Raleigh on March the 9th and was in Bellingham on March the 13th, but since there is no paper trail for her after that, it's reasonable to assume that her Jeep wound up in the embankment that very same day, even though it was not actually discovered until the 18th. According to her debit records, Leah only used her card at one motel near Memphis, so unless she stopped at some other places and paid with cash, you have to wonder if Leah spent the rest of her trip sleeping inside her Jeep. This could actually provide an explanation for what is considered to be one of the most baffling details of this case, and that's the blankets which were covering the Jeep's windows when it was found at the bottom of the embankment. The initial impression is that after the Jeep crashed, Leah might have put up these blankets to use the vehicle as a shelter before she disappeared. However, another explanation is that Leah could have already put these blankets up before the crash took place. For instance, we know she stopped at a gas station in Brooks, Oregon, shortly before 1 a.m. on March the 13th, so if she went somewhere and spent the night sleeping in the Jeep, she could have put the blankets up as shelter, but didn't bother to take them down after she woke up and drove to Bellingham. Therefore, when the Jeep eventually crashed, the blankets were already in place beforehand. This would definitely provide an explanation for why the blankets would be there if someone intentionally crashed the Jeep down the embankment while the vehicle was unoccupied. But before we talk more about Leah, we have to address the mystery within a mystery, and that's the fate of her pet kitten, Bee, whom she took along on a road trip. I know many of you listeners are animal lovers, so I'm sorry to say that we still don't have any idea about what happened to Bee. While no one from Leah's personal life has ever stated that she was suicidal, the fact that she specifically wrote, quote, "I'm not suicidal," in her farewell note, does give off the impression that this may have been a legitimate concern. I suppose it's possible that after crashing her Jeep, Leah could have gone into the woods to end her own life, but in online discussions about this case, I've seen cat lovers argue that even if Leah was feeling suicidal, she would have at least taken steps to ensure that Bee was taken care of. While I've personally never owned a cat, I've also seen cat lovers say that taking one on a long cross-country road trip would be a major headache because cats can get bored from all that endless driving and start acting up. It's interesting how the last confirmed sighting of Leah was when she attended a screening of American Beauty, which is a 2-hour movie, before she presumably stopped to grab something to eat at the mall restaurant. I'm sure she wouldn't have been allowed to take the cat into the theater or the restaurant, so did she really leave Bee alone in the Jeep that entire time? The presence of the empty cat carrier at the crash scene suggests that Bee may have been released somewhere before the Jeep went down the embankment. If someone intentionally caused the crash, I hope they had the decency to set Bee free, but given what a remote wilderness area this was, I'm not sure she would have been able to make it back to civilization. Anyway, the security camera footage of Leah at the gas station convenience store in Brooks does not give off the impression that there was anything wrong with her at the time, though it did show her glancing out into the parking lot several times, which has led to speculation that there may have been someone outside waiting for her. I personally think that Leah was probably still alone at this point, and that she may have been glancing outside to check on her cat. It takes just over 5 hours to drive from Brooks to Bellingham, so looking at the timeline, I'm guessing that after leaving the gas station, Leah stopped to sleep somewhere before she arrived in Bellingham to attend the 2:10 p.m. screening of American Beauty. Incidentally, this was just 2 weeks before the Academy Awards, where the film had received 8 nominations and it wound up taking home 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. In case you've never seen it, the lead character in American Beauty is a miserable, unhappy suburbanite who has a serious midlife crisis and starts questioning the purpose of everything. Given how introspective Leah seemed to be at this time, I can understand her making a pit stop on a road trip in order to see this movie. We have multiple eyewitnesses who placed Leah at a restaurant inside the Bellis Fair Mall after the screening took place, which is technically the last time she was confirmed to be alive. I know that eyewitnesses are often mistaken in missing persons cases, but the two men who sat next to Leah at the bar specifically mentioned her talking about Jack Kerouac and her cross-country trip, so I think they definitely spoke to her. But of course the big complication in this case is that one of these men described Leah as leaving with a man named Barry, while the other is adamant that she left alone. And since no one else who was at the restaurant that day can confirm the existence of the mysterious Barry, this is why police have become suspicious of the eyewitness. Now, the restaurant employee stated that Leah was alone when she originally arrived, so I find it very odd that someone else would later walk in there and Leah would immediately recognize him and say his name out loud. As far as anyone knows, Leah had never been to Bellingham before or had any ties to the area, so unless she had bumped into Barry at the American Beauty screening or somewhere else, how would she know him? Did Leah know Barry from a previous encounter, and it was just a wild coincidence that they happened to bump into each other in Bellingham? Another reason that people are skeptical of the eyewitness's story is that he was able to provide such a detailed description of Barry that police were able to generate a composite sketch. If his story is true, it sounds like he would have only seen Barry for a few seconds, and given how this would have seemed like such a mundane event at that time, I'm surprised he could remember Barry so vividly. Theoretically, if this guy was responsible for Leah's disappearance, he could have brainstormed a completely fictitious suspect to lead the police on a wild goose chase. Now, like I mentioned earlier, someone claiming to be this witness commented on a blog several years ago maintaining that his story about Barry was true and that the police have misrepresented the facts in order to make him look like a suspect. Well, if he's telling the truth, what about this other witness who spoke to Leah in the restaurant and said she left alone? We don't have any information about this guy, but he was the one who voluntarily phoned in the tip to the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office when he recognized Leah's photo from her missing persons flyer, and I'm not sure why he would do that if he was involved in her disappearance. If Leah did leave the restaurant alone, the one detail I would be interested in knowing is if the suspected witness left immediately thereafter. If so, then this would suggest that he followed Leah, but if he remained in the restaurant for a long period of time, then I don't see how he could possibly be involved in what happened. Since Leah's American Beauty ticket stub was found inside her Jeep, we do know that she at least made it back there after leaving the mall, but what happened to her afterwards is a complete mystery. We have a window of 5 days before her Jeep was found at the bottom of the embankment, but the location was so remote that I don't have a hard time believing it could have remained undiscovered for that length of time. If Leah's destination was Desolation Peak, then it would make sense that she would exit Bellingham and start traveling east, but it's worth noting that the road she was on, Mount Baker Highway, would not have taken her there, as it eventually leads to a dead end at Mount Baker. In order to travel to Desolation Peak, Leah would have needed to travel south of Bellingham and turn east on the North Cascades Highway. But of course, as someone who was unfamiliar with the area, Leah could have easily made a wrong turn or gotten lost. By the time she left the mall, it would have been nightfall, and I'm sure Mount Baker Highway would not have been easy to navigate in the darkness. Given that the embankment was located next to a slight curve, it's not hard to imagine Leah accidentally crashing down there. But there are details which lend credence to the idea of the accident being staged. Now, I know this was just a reenactment, and the details might not be 100% accurate, but when the Unsolved Mystery segment showed the scene where the joggers discover a shirt hanging from a tree branch next to the embankment, it looks like it has been intentionally tied there. So you have to wonder if someone planted the shirt there in hopes that someone would notice it and look down the embankment and see the wrecked Jeep, because otherwise, it could have remained unnoticed for an even longer amount of time. The condition of the Jeep clearly seemed to indicate that it rolled over at least once before it reached the bottom, so it's reasonable to assume that if anyone was inside there, they would have been seriously injured, yet there was no blood or any other physical evidence at the scene. But if Leah was in the driver's seat and she did survive the crash, then it's reasonable to assume she suffered some sort of injury which caused her to become disoriented. If that is what happened, then I'd say the most logical explanation is that she wandered off into the woods and died because it sounds like the embankment was steep enough that it would have been difficult for an injured woman to climb back up and make it to the road. And even if Leah did that, this was a remote enough area that the odds of her being picked up by a passing motorist were not great. Theoretically, if she was picked up by some serial killer who did her harm, then they're obviously not going to report it. But again, what are the odds of this happening at such a remote location? While we're on the subject of serial killers, I know that online sleuths often attempt to link the late Israel Keyes to unsolved cold cases. Since he was serving in the Army and was stationed at Fort Lewis in Washington State during this time period, I have seen his name tossed around as a potential suspect in Leah's disappearance. Well, Keyes was actually on temporary duty assignment in Egypt from January until June of 2000, so I think we can firmly slam the door on the idea of him being the perpetrator here. I will say that if Leah did survive the crash and managed to make it out of the area, then she would have only done so if she was completely disoriented and lost her memory, because it makes no sense for her to leave all her possessions behind at the scene, including over $2,400 in cash and her mother's engagement ring. I think the only reason this theory is given much credence is because of the phone call from the anonymous male, who said he saw Leah looking disoriented at a gas station in Everett, but since Everett is around 90 miles away from the crash site, there's no way Leah could have wound up there unless someone gave her a ride. It's my guess that the caller may have been mistaken and saw another young woman who resembled Leah, but since he seemed to abruptly panic and hang up before the police could question him, I'm not sure how much credibility we can give this guy. It's very possible that if Leah was a victim of foul play, the caller was her killer, and he intentionally did this in order to create misdirection and give off the false impression she was still alive. It seems like the main reason investigators now lean towards the accident being staged was the discovery that the Jeep's starter motor had been tampered with, which could have allowed someone to start the ignition and accelerate the Jeep off the road into the embankment without anyone being behind the wheel to use the gas pedal. Obviously, this is not something which just anyone is going to know how to do, but since the witness from the mall restaurant had worked as a mechanic and may have possessed the necessary technical knowledge, that's one more reason why investigators have looked at him as a potential suspect. Now, we know the fingerprints found under the Jeep's hood did not match this guy, but we still can't even be 100% certain if the prints are relevant to this case. For all we know, Leah could have stopped at a gas station somewhere on a road trip where an attendant lifted the hood to check her oil or something and left their prints behind. And of course, there's still ambiguity about whether or not the male DNA found on Leah's clothing matched this witness, but I'm guessing it did not. I would say that the DNA evidence holds greater significance, since there really isn't an innocent explanation for how it could have gotten there. I will say that if Leah was the victim of foul play, robbery was certainly not the motive for the crime, as whoever crashed that Jeep into the embankment did not have any interest in taking her mother's engagement ring or her money or any of her other possessions. I do find the placement of the engagement ring under the floor mat to be incredibly odd, because I don't see how it could have wound up there by accident. By all accounts, it would have been very out of character for Leah to take off the ring herself, but if she was murdered and the killer disposed of her body at another location, why would they go to the trouble of removing the ring from her finger and placing it under the mat? If Leah was murdered, I have a feeling that whoever was responsible was very familiar with the area. As I frequently mentioned, that embankment was located in a pretty remote area, and it doesn't sound like the type of location you would just stumble upon by pure chance. So somebody may have figured this would be a good place to stage the scene. That spot could have been picked, since the curve in the road made it look like a plausible location where someone might get into an accident. But of course, if a third party drove the Jeep out there and intentionally ran it off the road, how did they get back home? That spot is in the middle of nowhere, a great distance away from civilization, So could this mean there was a second person involved who drove there in a separate vehicle for them to leave the scene? And if Leah was the victim of foul play, where did she originally cross paths with her killer? Did she really meet a guy at the Bellis Fair Mall named Barry who subsequently murdered her? If so, what did he do with her body? Overall, this is a pretty puzzling case where none of the evidence completely adds up, and I'm just not sure that any one theory makes 100% complete sense. Regardless of whether Leah crashed into the embankment on her own or the accident was staged, it has been over 2 decades since she went missing, so I think the chances of her surviving the ordeal and still being alive out there somewhere with no memory of who she is are pretty slim. If Leah was not a victim of foul play and did succumb to the elements after walking into the woods following the crash, it's going to be difficult to find her remains, but the best chance they might have is the metal rod inside her leg, which could be picked up by a metal detector someday. But if Leah was murdered, then I have no idea where to start looking for her body, because that particular section of Washington State is a vast wilderness. All that being said, if you happen to have any information about the unsolved disappearance of Leah Roberts, please contact the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office at 360-676-6650. That's 360-676-6650. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, I released an episode on a famous case from Unsolved Mysteries about wanted fugitive Adam Emery, who may have faked his death after he was convicted of murder and has not been seen for nearly 30 years. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Sherman H., Scott, Grace H., and BJ. Thank you all so much for your support. I'd also like to mention that later this year, provided that it becomes safe to travel again, The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing on Podcast Row at the very first CrimeCon UK, which is being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on the weekend of September the 25th and 26th, so fingers crossed that it will happen as planned. If you would like to purchase tickets to either event, we have a special promo code you can use to get a 10% discount. So to receive 10% off, visit crimecon.co.uk and enter the promo code COLD21. That's COLD21. In addition, I also wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, which both have a lot of interesting discussions about this case. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the ear music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold. Thank you.